Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Well, let's go ahead and let's do another one here. This one yet again based on one of your newer suggestions. This one, interestingly enough, also having to do with yet another UFO lake type encounter. I just did a video of that the other day involving a Russian lake. In this case though, this lake happens to be there in Canada. Not only that, but it also involves another attack of sorts, and there's also UFO evidence, in this case of some materials associated with this encounter. And then to top things off, there's also a book that was written by one of the relatives of the person that had this encounter. So if you wanted some more detailed information about it, I'll include more of it here in just a minute. But it has to do with this. You're looking at interpretation of it, at least. There's various names tied to it, but for this case, I'll go ahead and I'll call it the Falcon Lake UFO Incident. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating information associated with this encounter. So what was this Falcon Lake UFO Incident? Well, this was something that occurred a little whiles back, in this case in 1967, specifically May 20th, and it was there at a location again called Falcon Lake. It goes by another lake name also. It's known as Manitoba Lake. I guess you gotta flip a coin when it comes to essentially what it's called, but it's a lake that's encountered about 150 kilometers east of Winnipeg. Very serene looking lake. You're looking at some pictures of it here now, and surrounding it is just pretty much just wilderness, although I was reading that there's also a little town there as well. I don't know if this town was back then at that location, but still for now, at least for this purposes of today, yeah, it's there in this case. But the way that this encounter happened was this. There was a gentleman named by the name of Stefan Michalak, who you're looking at a picture of here. He was someone that was a mechanic, an industrial mechanic, very, very good apparently when it came to welding and then other sorts of things associated with his trade. But as a nice hobby, he was someone that was interested in geologists, like in that type of field. And so he was someone that would constantly venture out towards that lake and then also try to prospect for quartz and silver. So much so that apparently he had some claims there out there, and then that way he could freely do so on his own, on his property, the whatever he claimed out there, and then he could be able to obtain whatever was listed there in terms of these quartz. In fact, it was on that weekend of May 20th, 1967, when this 51-year-old guy was there, once again, by an area known as the Precambrian Shield. I think it was near a vein of quartz that he had discovered there by that specific claim, and he was there just minding his own business, trying to find this type of stuff. The way I was reading his information, too, is that he was someone that had moved there essentially earlier in his life, had settled there as well. He also knew several languages, which will come up here more in a minute as to why that's important. But yeah, there he was just minding his own business when suddenly this thing happened. Apparently there was a group of geese that suddenly started erupting around him, like they gave the telltale sign of these nervous honks. You know how geese make that very distinctive sound, right? Well, apparently they were just suddenly doing that left and right, and they were flying by. Something had clearly scared them as far as what they were encountering nearby. And so he decided to take a look, and he descended to an area there nearby the lake. And as it happened, that's when he saw this. He saw these two cigar-shaped objects, the way they were described, with a big reddish glow associated to them. And in his case, the way he was descending, they were now about 45 meters away. And in fact, one of them actually happened to land at the same time that he was coming up upon them. The other one, though, pretty much stood there in a hovering motion, and then it immediately just took off. Who knows where it went, but it basically disappeared at that point. But the other one essentially was there, happened to be landing right in front of him, right in the flat section of rock near his area. And so what was interesting was this guy, Stefan, he was someone that was, I guess, cool and calm about the situation. Other people might have gone into a panic mode or some other type of excited mode, but no, in his case, he decided to just watch it for at least 30 minutes or so. And according to him, he thought that it was actually some kind of U.S. military experimental craft, something that just happened to be in his vicinity that is doing some kind of test or was just on some kind of rogue flight of sorts, but he was there witnessing it, and that's what his first thought was. And so when he realized that after about half an hour, nothing was occurring, occurring, that's when he had the guts to essentially walk up straight to that aircraft and then look around it. Before he did that, though, he spent the 30 minutes sketching this thing, whatever it was, into a notepad that he had, and you're looking at the drawing of it here. Interesting, though, right? When it comes to its representation, it pretty much looks like your classic UFO, right down to the oval shape associated with it, the top little floor, if you could call it that, maybe even some of those bright lights as well. And so he had plenty of time to do so as he was observing it for that half hour. And so when he finally decided to approach it, that's when he realized something else was coming from the craft. Either there was something emitting from it, or it in turn caused the area around it to smell like this. But otherwise, there was a very, very strong smell of sulfur. Sulfur definitely has that distinct smell. No, if you've ever smelled it, you know it, because it's very, very strong. So that's essentially what he was smelling. On top of that, the area around him had this kind of warm air tied to it as well. So I'm guessing during that time period, it was relatively cool. Remember, this was like May 20th or so up there in Canada, a portion of Canada. So it had to have been cooler in all regards. But here, approaching this aircraft, it definitely had this warmish air. And then also he heard more of what this thing was creating. It was almost like a whirring sound of sorts, and there was this strange hissing that was in the air too. But what was most shocking of all was this. One of the doors, if you could call it that, was open on the side of the actual aircraft, of the actual UFO, and within it, at least from the area that he was at, he saw that there was these bright lights inside, and then most shocking of all, inside of that, he heard voices. Who knows what these voices were saying? Who knows if he could understand it at all? My guess is that this was obviously in some kind of completely different language. Who knows what kind of inflection they had, vocalization, whatever they were muttering. It just pretty much stayed a mystery up until this day, but there were definitely voices that were coming from inside the craft, and that of course just made him even more curious. Interestingly enough, this guy Stefan still thought that this was not a UFO. He thought that this was still a U.S. military aircraft, and so he actually approached it because he wanted to help them out. According to him, he wanted to see if these quote-unquote Yankee boys needed any kind of help from him, because maybe they were lost, maybe they needed help with their aircraft, they had gone down and they needed some kind of assistance. That essentially what was Stefan, what he was thinking at that time. And when they didn't respond back to him in regular English, remember I was mentioning earlier that he knew multiple languages. Here's where things came into play. He decided to talk to them in his native Polish. That didn't work, and so he finally switched to Russian, and then that didn't work, and then he finally switched to German, and that didn't work either. So he was definitely a multilingualist, and in this case, it proved to him that whatever was inside clearly wasn't responding to anything as far as those languages, even of course being English itself being the most dominant language and around that area. They would have definitely responded to something. And so that's when this craft suddenly did a different thing. These voices, whenever he started talking to them, shut down first. Like, in other words, they suddenly went eerily quiet. They knew whatever was inside, they knew that suddenly something was outside. And it was this guy, Stefan, and it was because of the way he was approaching them and then trying to talk to them in those multiple languages. Well, when they shut down, they decided to do this next course of action. Apparently, there was this loud whir, like this motion sound associated with this UFO, and there was this continued hiss. And then that's when he went closer to the aircraft. He started to inspect it. Still, I guess thinking that this was something from the U.S., he decided to inspect the actual metal on the outside of the ship, and then him, being a welder of sorts, noticed that there was no seams. It was just perfectly smooth all around. Obviously, nothing really here on this earth could be that perfect when it came to what he saw there. And then when he looked into the doorway, the thing inside the lights now became so bright that the welding goggles that he normally had on him, he had to actually put them down to protect his eyes, and then that way he could see more clearly. And then that's when he saw that there was these light panels, there were these beams, there were these flashing lights as well. None of it really made any sense, but there they were, essentially inside the actual UFO, or in his case, American ship, as he was calling it. And then there was these other type of things that were just there in terms of, I don't know, contraptions or some other type of devices there that, again, didn't really make any sense. But to his shock, he didn't really get to see it too long, because get this, those things that were inside the UFO decided to take action. That whirring sound and everything else that I was mentioning earlier, it suddenly caused not just one, not just two, but 3 panels to shut in front of that door that he was inspecting. And when that happened, it sealed it completely shut. There was obviously no way to get in, and whoever was inside, no way to get out. And so he decided to inspect things even further, maybe even try to pry it open. He said that when he put, and he had on a glove at the time because, again, he was chipping at rocks and he was using this type of protective gear to make sure he could do so, he used his glove to touch the actual craft, and that's when he realized that it was melting the fingertips of his gloves. So quite lucky on his regard with regards to Stefan that he had those gloves and that he wasn't doing anything else like in terms of human contact with that actual UFO. But then this whirring sound caused the craft to turn counterclockwise. I'm sure he must have been shocked at that point seeing this gliding thing go in motion, and then that's when all of a sudden there was this panel that was suddenly in front of him. My guess is that this panel was on the other side of the UFO this whole time, and so when that counterclockwise motion happened, it twisted it, like, let's say, almost like sliding a lid off a cup or doing something else in terms of a circular motion. It twisted that panel straight to him, and he saw that there was these grid of holes that were there as well. But the next thing that happened is what I was mentioning earlier as far as an attack, if you could call it that. That's when all of a sudden there was this very, very hot blast of air or gas that hit him straight in the chest, point blank, straight in the chest. So these grid of holes emanated this blast of air or gas, if you could call it, with such a strong force that it actually pushed him, it catapulted him backwards, and it did so pretty much like blasting him into the air and then him landing a good whiles back, and then there he was essentially shocked at what occurred. But on top of that, this gas or air was so hot that it set that shirt that he had on fire, and it set his cap that he had on as well on fire too. And so he immediately had to rip it off because of his circumstances. Otherwise he would suffer even more burns afterward. And with that, this crazy UFO, whatever it was, decided to go up into the air, and then it just silently flew away. Whatever it was that it was doing at that point, I don't know again if it was a straight up attack, but it decided it had enough, and it just flew away, and it was pretty much never seen again by him. Now here's where things take a little bit of a different turn. So I was reading various versions of this, both of them different, so it's pretty much you pick and choose which way it goes, because in one version I read, it was this guy Stefan decided to isolate himself. He realized all of a sudden that something had happened to him, something dangerous. Not only that, but he was also having these burns to his chest and his stomach that looked exactly like that grid-like pattern that was on the UFO itself. So he decided to go back into his motel room, and he decided to stay there as long as he could on an isolated basis until he went back to his home. I think it was somewhere there in Winnipeg. And so he decided to do so and be isolated for weeks on afterward, but still suffering from whatever the side effects were of that blast. There were those burns to those chests I was mentioning earlier, and then apparently he suffered from diarrhea, headaches, severe blackouts, and weight loss. And this was witnessed by his son as well. More on that here in just one moment. So that's essentially one version of it. The other version is this. He decided to alert authorities as to what was occurring, still keeping himself isolated in some way, like refusing to go to find some kind of medical help, but still alerting authorities because he wanted to make sure that nobody else would suffer what he just suffered. So if anyone else came across this UFO, then he wanted the authorities to know about it so they could alert others, and they wouldn't in turn be attacked the way he was attacked by this UFO. But when that happened, the authorities actually thought that they were dealing with, get this, they were dealing with a drunk. They were dealing with someone that apparently had too much to drink and was giving them this type of fantastical tale. And apparently the authorities there said that because he had these watery eyes, because he was slurring, because he had these movements that indicated, that pointed towards the idea that he was drunk. Never mind the fact, of course, of those burns that were on him. But because of that, they realized, themselves that they're dealing with someone that's incapacitated due to drinking, and so they didn't really take him too seriously. So there's that version of it as well. So it's hard to tell which one is real one. There might even be a middle version altogether. But otherwise, his son was still another witness. In fact, you're looking at one of the book that he wrote on it here. This is the book that details more of the encounter, like essentially what his father went through when he went back home, how he suffered. It's called When They Disappeared, Falcon Lake 1967, The Inside Story of a Close Encounter. And in it, he pretty much details everything that his father had to go through once this incident occurred. And I think also it includes like his father's own detailed accounts of the UFO encounter as well. But either way, though, if you wanted to check it out, you'll be able to see more information on it. But if you wonder what happened to Stefan, pretty much he died in 1999. He ended up having complications from that blast ever since that time period up until the day he died, and apparently he still believed 100% obviously that it happened. And again, based on diversion, either he shared it or he believed that no one else should ever have heard this encounter, either way. But otherwise, yeah, that's what ended up happening to him. But to my recollection, looking at the information, nothing else really occurred to him in terms of another encounter with this UFO. Even though it was a one-off incident, it definitely left a lifetime of physical impairment because of what occurred to him, both on the chest and on the stomach level, and then also with all those illnesses I was mentioning too. But if anybody has any more information, anything else I might have missed as far as this encounter, please post those comments below. How about that? Anybody from the Falcon Lake area, maybe there in Manitoba, maybe someone that has been there in the past or is going there in the nearby future, let us know too if you've had any weird encounters, if there's other UFOs that have been sighted there too. Remember at the beginning of the story, there was 2 of them. So one of them left early on, so who knows, maybe that second one made an appearance afterward. And it'd be great to hear if anyone has any of that type of information there too. So what about this? Anybody that read that book when they appeared there as well? And to see if the son's information there, if you can tell us like what it entailed and all the rich details associated with it. I'd love to hear it too. His story has actually gone on to be in other type of mediums, like it was on Unsolved Mysteries, and then it was also on several documentaries regarding other UFO incidents. So it goes to show this is a very, very popular tale there in Canada. In fact, I forgot to mention at the beginning, but it's known as one of Canada's most well-known documented UFO cases. But again, if anybody has any information, please let us know. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.